with horticulture and with art and with conservation. So, try to support all four of them, please. So, okay, we are going to shift gears now. We have our final speaker of the evening, who is Dana Needleman. And Dana manages the Giving Grove program for Memphis Tilth. Remember back in January, we heard just about a 1-minute description of the program, and we wanted to know more. And so now is our opportunity to do that. Dana is a recent transplant to the Mid-South, and they earned a Bachelor of Arts in Biological and Medical Anthropology from the University of Washington. Since then, Dana has worked on various projects involving human and wildlife interactions, community farming and composting, and other initiatives to improve food security through sustainable practices and urban farming. One of those is the Giving Grove program. Dana, let me turn it over to you, please.
All right, thank you. Hello, my name's Dana. As Steve shared, I am a recent transplant to Memphis. I've been living on the West Coast for the last 25 years of my life. I will say that this spring is amazing, and I've never quite experienced a spring like this in my life. And I will say I might be hooked just based off of the amount of colors that are happening around. So I appreciate all of that, and I get why everyone's so excited about plants here. Okay, great. Let me start. Oh, I have this. Yeah. All right. Can we see that? Yep, great. Okay, I added a cheesy title called Tremendous Times. As I said, my name's Dana. I'm the Giving Grove manager at Memphis Tilth. And here's a picture of me farming. I will also say that I've come into this world as a wildlife person, so I am very amazed at all of the plant knowledge, and it's all very interconnected, so I appreciate that aspect of it. So I work at Memphis Tilth, and as I copied a part of the website here, but it says our mission is to cultivate collective action for an economically sustainable, socially equitable, and environmentally sound local food system. So we have a few different programs here in Memphis. We have a food hub under the Grow Local. If you want to check any of this more out, it's on the website, the Memphis Tilth website. We also have a few community gardens throughout the city, and we're working on getting more of those up and running. I also co-manage a community garden near the Tilth office in South Memphis called the St. Paul Garden. And I don't know if y'all are familiar, but there's a garden at the St. Jude Hospital that we grow. Well, they have their own team, but it's under the same umbrella of Memphis Tilth, but they grow food to then provide fresh, healthy vegetables and fruits to the patients at St. Jude. So that's a really amazing thing that Tilth does. And we have some cooking classes and urban agriculture academy, a few different things. As COVID has been kind of impacting how we do everything, the in-person food classes are a bit different, and we're adapting. But that's kind of an overall Memphis Tilth background. And so the Giving Grove program was actually started in Kansas City, and the Giving Grove program is planting orchards in urban environments as a way to provide access to fresh, healthy fruit, nut, and other kinds, well, mostly fruits, nuts, and berries. And it started in 2013. And so since then, there's about 200 orchards planted in Kansas City. So after they kind of got their footing, they have been expanding into other cities. So there's a Giving Grove program in partnership with other cities in Louisville, Cincinnati, St. Louis, and Omaha. So Memphis is a part of that. So here's a nice little flyer that we like to have about how kindness, health, community, sustainability, opportunity, and knowledge grow on trees. And I'll get into a little bit more than that, but I think that it's an important way to engage with people. And I think planting trees has a lot of long-term lessons to be taught with it that I think a lot of us in this modern day society are very used to instant gratification. And in the process of planting trees, having to wait to harvest them, they only, bear fruit in one chunk of time throughout the year, that it's kind of, in opposition to what we've grown used to. So that's not necessarily why Give and Grove is doing this, but I think that's a valuable aspect to it, that there's some persistent patience, care, and love put into growing fruiting trees, or any plants in general, but trees, they take a bit longer because, there's sometimes, well, I don't know if you know, but a lot of the fruit trees that we plant, they take a few years in order to actually produce any fruit. But then on the other side of that is that they'll last for 40, 50, 80 years, depending on what kind of tree it is. So that it's a longer term investment. So here's some information about the ecological impact of having an orchard planted, especially in an urban environment. This is based off of a 15 tree orchard, which most of the ones that we planted in Memphis haven't been that large. A lot of the plots that we're working with in Memphis are more, old housing plots that aren't, they wouldn't have the amount of space to fit 15 trees, but it's a similar impact if you just scale it down a little bit. So this says that it can serve 12,000 servings of fruit, and it can sequester 2.7 tons of carbon dioxide. Also having a more complex ecosystem that has fruiting trees as a part of it helps a lot with water retention. And there's a whole variety of things that we can plant. So this is from the more national organization. In terms of Memphis specifically, Memphis has a lot of food insecurity, a lot of food deserts, a lot of people living in poverty. I don't think you need me to come in here as someone that's just moved here to tell you that. But a part of why having a program like the Give and Grow program in Memphis is so important is because it creates this long-term access to food that a lot of the time is kind of the opposite of shorter term projects that want to come in and just like food or, fix the food crisis in Memphis. But planting trees, it's a long-term community invested, community engagement kind of approach to fighting the food insecurity that's in Memphis and all around the US, but specifically in Memphis. So I included this. This is from feedingamerica.org, so I'm not claiming that I created this data or came up with it. But you can tell that the food insecurity rate in Memphis being almost 22% is extremely high. An integral part of having a Give and Grove is that we are hoping to plant these orchards in areas that are open and accessible to people that don't have access to food otherwise, or are in certain communities that are underserved. So we're not a landscaping company coming in to plant orchards in your home, but if there's a community garden near your home or in your neighborhood or near your church or anything like that there is space to grow fruit trees in, we come and at a low price help you install them. And what's also different about Give and Grove is that we provide a lot of educational material, and someone comes out to help you throughout the year with your understanding of pruning and scouting for pests and how to plant them. And so it's not just selling people trees, but it's also actually physically planting them, coming up with a site plan of where we're planting them, what can be planted together. It's more of a well-rounded, we're like a coach of orcharding. Yeah, I'm not checking. I don't know. I can't even access the chat. So if there's a question, I'll just wait until the end. I was going to say, are there any questions? But I guess I'll just wait. So in terms of how to select for a site, we put out some feelers of who wanted to get involved with Giving Grove. Hold on, I have to sneeze. I'm sorry. Oh, rude. I apologize for that. There's a lot of people that are very excited about planting orchards, and there's certain, as with planting any plants, we have to make sure that the plants are going to have what they need. And with trees, it's a bit more nuanced. So they need to have about 6 to 8 hours of sun a day. And I've been to definitely more than one site where everyone has these beautiful, like, hundreds of years old oak trees. And then there's so much space underneath them. And they're like, oh, well, this is a great space to grow food. And it's like, yes, one of the beautiful things about Memphis is all of these big old trees. But the other side of that is that it doesn't really leave a lot of room for the access to sunlight. So similar to other plants, we need a south-facing open space, which ties in the air movement. So there's been a few schools that have been inquiring about having a Giving Grove planted where they have like a courtyard and they want to plant it within the courtyard, but not having any airflow in the area creates a lot of pressure for fungal diseases, which especially in Memphis with how wet and hot it is already a problem we have to deal with. So that kind of just like stacks against the health of the trees. So we want to make sure that it has sun access and air movement. In terms of having good drainage, we want to make sure that it's not in like a swampy area. And for certain plants, like we've been doing blackberries, raspberries, and blueberries, and all of those need pretty well drained soil. So there's some ways to remedy that. If there's a slight slope, we'll plant them at the top of the slope. If there's no slope, we'll build up kind of a volcano little shape and plant them in the middle and heavily mulch it around. So there's ways around it, but you want to make sure that the soil is well drained. We do a soil test. And that's another important thing in Memphis or any urban area. When planting food that is going to be eaten, is making sure that there's not any heavy metals in the soil. And that's an important consideration. We've been using Waypoint Analytics, so that's someone we've been using. And something interesting that I did learn from someone at a training from Cincinnati is that they were saying that with lead specifically, which is one of the biggest heavy metals that we deal with in urban environments, is that the lead actually doesn't want to go up into the food and into the fruit or into the parts of the plant that you're harvesting. It wants to go back into the ground. It's like, because it's a heavy metal, it has a lot of weight to it, and so it actually wants to sink back into the earth. So what's to be considered in terms of heavy metals in the soil is the literal like process of planting them. That's important because that's when you're unearthing the soil, and that's when the lead and other heavy metals can be kicked up. Another factor we have to consider, and this is, I included this from a specific nursery's website. I can send along the information for that as well. But so the slide before was about how to determine where to plant and how many trees we can plant. Also, in general, the trees, it depends on the variety, but they want to be planted around 10 to 16 feet away from each other. Unless you're doing some permaculture, very like small scale heavily pruning them. But if they're just left to their own devices, we should be planting them 10 to 15 feet away from each other. And it depends on the variety as well, but yeah. Another consideration is that if someone's like, I want one apple tree, it's not going to work. They need to have pollinators, or they need to have a variety planted with them that allows for pollinators. So I found this very helpful, where it is a more visual representation of what you can plant together. So pears, apples need to be planted with a species in the same species, but a different variety. And peaches do not. Jujubes, which we have some, they need two different varieties, a lang and a lee, sorry. Blackberries don't need a pollinator. Blueberries, they're better if they have one of the same species but a different variety. But I think they'll do okay without. But it's really better to plant them together. And then raspberries, they don't need a pollinator. So this chart is specifically European pear. If you're curious about planting, I won't get into this so much, but it also depends if you're planting a bare root or a potted tree. So that is that changes things, but you basically want to create the dimensions here, the 32 by 36 inches wide, 16 to 20 inches deep. And something I've noticed specifically with the trees in our nursery is that the roots have grown very much so into the bag. So it's not like, some of the blackberries that we have, when we pull them out of the pot, they're all like wrapped around each other and then they grow into each other instead. But with trees, they'll just keep growing. So they really want to be in the ground. So that's something to consider if they're in pots for a long time, that you have to kind of unearth them from the pots. And another important thing is that when you plant them, you don't want to have the graft union buried. This next slide is about grafting, but I'm not sure if this is common knowledge, but I'll just go over it briefly. But with fruiting trees, pretty much all of them are grafted on a scion is grafted onto a rootstock. The rootstocks are selected for their hardiness in different climates, and the scion is the part that actually produces the fruit. So we want to make sure that the graft union, which is like a lifelong scar, basically, once again, I'm sure y'all know this, but that's buried, or that it's not buried, that it's well above the surface of the ground. Another thing with when you're physically planting the fruiting trees is you want to really heavily mulch and compost them, and you want to plant them a bit higher than you would other kinds of plants, because as soon as the rain comes, they will sink down as the roots are growing in and trying to get their hold. And you don't want the roots to be going above the tree, because then water will pool towards the rootstock and the graft union, and that's a really big problem with funguses. So here's just an example of different ways to graft trees. Oh, something loud just happened, sorry. Yeah, I won't get more into grafting right now. Specifically for Memphis, I included some pictures of places that we've planted so far. I've been in this role since February, so I'm newer. So this spring planting season is something that I'm spearheading. And the previous person before me planted 3 community gardens with orchards. The Carpenter Art Garden another community garden called The Time Is Now Douglas, and then Orange Mound. So those were done in the fall, and then this is at a site up in North Memphis off on Chelsea, and here are some trees planted. This is a site that Memphis Tilth runs. So you can see that they're pretty heavily mulched. I didn't stake these ones because most of them are growing pretty straight up. And typically in a nursery, and I'm sure at the other places, if y'all are selling trees, you have trees that are a bit more like the one on the left of this picture and less like the one on the right. So typically in a nursery, they're a bit younger than some of the ones that we have, but that's right, we're getting them in the ground. On the left is a picture of how we built our blackberry trellis. There was some bamboo from one of the people that works at Tilth at a house that they have access to, and so we use that. So I think it's an interesting and cool point to include that in terms of building a trellis system or building all these things, and it doesn't necessarily have to be like state-of-the-art, top-notch, perfected design, but a trellis is basically for plants that need to grow up something and be supported by some sort of structure so that when they get fruit on them that they don't then break. So here you can see we just use bamboo and it'll support them when they get heavy. And then the one on the right is a picture of a planting I did last week at the E.E. Jeter School up in Millington. So you can see that they're going to use the fence for one side and then the trellis on the other side. And those are blackberries. So the blackberries on the left are at the garden I co-manage. They've been doing great. I will also say today I was at the garden and there's some blackberries planted along the street, and there was a guy walking by and he was like, "Did you cut down the blackberries? Where did they go?" And he was so upset. And we're like, "Oh no, we just pruned them down for the winter. They're coming back. It's okay." And he was like, "Oh, okay. I was gonna be really mad at you because I look forward to this every year." So that's another important thing with this, is that with planting brambles, bushes, and trees that are going to establish themselves well, that they'll be providing food for a long time. And so people like come to rely on them and get to know the plants pretty well and like feel like they have a relationship with them and be excited about them. So I think that's a really cool thing as well. Anyway, so the comparison is after a few years of being in the ground, still very heavily mulched, but then on the right is something that we planted like literally on Friday. So it's a bit newer. I included a lot of information about pruning, which I'm feeling like it's already 13 minutes past, so I'm going to just breeze by this. But in terms of pruning trees, there's a lot of considerations to have, and each kind of tree needs something different. So I included some reference photos as well. So these are the three main kinds of how to prune a tree: the central leader, which is typically apples and pears; modified leader, which also you can do with apples and pears; and then the open vase is more peaches, just to simplify it into those three because I have specific photos for them. When you're pruning, this is a much thicker looking tree than you will hopefully be pruning to see these angles with, because we don't want the branches of the tree to be growing at 30 degrees and then be that thick. Normally, if they're growing at an angle that's going to be unhealthy for the tree to sustain, then we cut them off or we prune them early. And so it shouldn't be this thick if you're considering if you should prune it or not. So you should be pruning them pretty early. So we want to have branches between 45 and 60 degree angles so they can support the weight of the fruit, because you have to think about how much weight that adds to each branch as soon as the fruit comes. And if it's less than 30 degrees and it's like very close to each other, as soon as it gets the weight, it's just going to break in half. And then that's pretty much, unfortunately, the end of that tree, because it'll be a really big injury that's hard for it to recover from. Here are some pruning tips of how to cut the trees. The one on the left is the correct one. So this is something that's important, is that when you're pruning, you want to kind of, I like to think of it as like time travel, because you have to be thinking about how the tree is going to want to be growing, and not how it wants it. You're looking at how it wants to be growing, and then you're factoring in how you want it to be growing. So going back a little bit, thinking about the overall structure of the trees, is what you do early to them is really important to the overall structure. So you will be heavily pruning them the first 5 years of their lives, and then after that it's maintenance. It's not as heavy, but you really have to be mindful and kind of hop into that like time traveling mindset of, okay, I know this branch is like the thickness of my finger, but when this is the thickness of my thigh, will this sustain? What direction is it growing in? Things like that. So that takes into account which cut you're making. And so we always want to be cutting for the bud facing outwards. So generally you want the tree coming down and out so that you can reach the fruit, because the tree is going to want to go up towards the sky as much as it can. And so you need to be selecting for it to be going outwards. Here's some more information about how to do that. I can share this as well if that would be helpful. Here are some in real life photos of this. You can see the left is what the tree wants to be doing, and the right is what we want it to be doing. So you can see that this is a pear tree, that it sends a lot of things going up, and then you are basically selecting for different scaffolds to be growing outwards, to which then other branches will grow from that. So I think having these comparison photos is really helpful to see kind of like what it is we mean by pruning. Peaches, you can see that it's much more of that open vase structure. And peaches, I will say, need to be pruned about 50% every year. And so people are like really taken aback by that. They're like, oh no, it's my peaches. But they grow so much that if you don't prune them, it's not even good for them to be growing as much as they want to be growing. So you want that open base. So you can see how heavy they prune that one. Apples as well. You want to have the different scaffolds growing in different directions so that they have fruit growing in a whirl basically around. Here you can see kind of the difference between on a tree what the fruit bud looks like versus the leaf bud. So when I was saying that you want to be pruning them to have the fruiting bud growing outwards to create more of that open shape, you want to make sure that what you're pruning is actually the fruiting bud and not the leaf bud. This is something I see around Memphis all the time. There are these suckers that grow out of the rootstock, and it happens in trees that I see that aren't fruiting trees. But the rootstock will basically want to grow its own foliage, and we don't want that because the rootstock is meant to be growing down and giving nutrients to the fruiting scion. So if you see these little buds growing out of either the very base of it, I've also seen it in the areas directly around the base. It doesn't just have to be out of the trunk. Those are suckers, and you want to prune those. You can kind of see that more so on the photo on the right. And these are best to prune in the dormant season. So in the winter is really the best time to be pruning. And you don't want to be pruning when it's going to be hot and wet, because then funguses are more likely to go into the injury site. This is kind of an overall calendar of what to be doing every month for managing fruit. There's a lot, as y'all can see. I don't think I really have time to go into this, but here's some information about that. I'm once again happy to share this with everyone if that would be helpful. I'm gonna just move on. I don't even think I can scratch the surface of that. Okay. I wanted to talk about another thing in terms of when to allow the trees to go to fruit. Asian pears specifically, which is the photo on the right, they will produce fruit like 2 years in. But for the first 2 to 3 years, depending how old the tree was when you got it from the nursery, you want to pick off those baby fruits, as you see on the right, or ideally pick off the flowers after they've been pollinated, and then before the flower turns into the fruit, for a lot of reasons. Two, most importantly, one, if the tree is putting so much energy into the fruit, it won't be rooting down as much as we want it to be. And the branches just literally aren't strong enough to hold them. So we need to tell the tree basically that despite the fact that you want to keep growing into those fruits, we don't want that just yet. Pick them off. It'll stop putting energy into it. It'll grow stronger branches, stronger roots, and then you'll have better fruit in the long term. So this is a picture of this is an apple, a Liberty apple on the left in its fruit, or sorry, in its flowering. And then on the right is that's a Chojuro Asian pear. And you can see the different, how the flower then turns into the fruit, which once again, maybe y'all know this, but I think it's cool to see that the flower then literally like the ovary of it then becomes the fruit. Cool. That's just more information about when to pick them. Another thing, once your tree is happy and producing fruit, you still want to thin the fruit in the spring and the summer. So you can see here that it'll put out 4 per one little bud. And if you leave that many there, I'll go to the next slide, that you can see that when they're growing close to each other, then it provides a lot more opportunity for pests and diseases where they're all scattered and like they don't have room to do their breathing and what they need to be doing. So here's a like visual representation of why it is important to thin them. Yeah. Okay, so scouting is another thing that's important to do. And I wrote that it's important to get to know your tree. So scouting is basically looking for pests, diseases, and checking out the overall resilience of your tree. So that is something that as you're in the spring, summer, and the fall, you should be watering them very heavily, about 5 gallons per tree for the first 5 years of its life. So while you're walking through your orchard, you want to make sure that there's no pests or diseases happening. I briefly included the names of some of the common diseases and pests in the area. It's like way too much of its own whole thing to get into it right now. But just generally, and I'm sure once again, as plant people, we all understand this, but if something looks like it is sick, if the leaves are wilting, if they're looking brown, if they're looking spotted, if it looks like a sick plant, then that means that you need to be watching it carefully and see if it gets worse, if there's a pest involved, things like that. So yeah, just seeing if something looks healthy or not. I feel like that's a bigger conversation than I can get into. But here's a list of some common diseases of fruit plants. We don't have any cherries, so I don't honestly know much about cherries. And there's also a lot of pests that can get in there as well. I think I just said pests, I meant diseases. Sorry. Once again, too big of a scope to really get into, but there's a lot of resources online. I'm also happy to share some information with y'all if that would be helpful. But an important thing is if you're scouting them early, a lot of them are laying dormant in the winter, and then as spring is happening, they're finding the exact perfect opportunity to get either into the flower or into the baby fruit, and then they grow with the fruit as the fruit grows. So if you can catch them as it's like 1 or 2 worms trying to get into the baby fruit, that'll be so much easier to deal with than when the whole tree is infested. Okay, I'm almost done, I promise. While we're trying to avoid pests, we also want to be accounting for pollinators. So this is something that I've noticed around Memphis, is that some people will want to plant an orchard in a lot that has nothing else on it, no other plants, and that's totally fine. But we need to make sure that the site is attracting pollinators for more reasons than just the trees. Because if we just put 2 trees out there that need pollinators to pollinate each other, and there isn't a fruiting plant around for a few miles, it's not really giving it a good shot in order to be pollinated, to produce fruit, to survive. So plant flowers with your trees. Very briefly, I'm definitely not an expert on choosing the varieties of trees for this area. As I said, I'm newly here in Memphis, so I don't want to steer anyone in the wrong direction. Going for certain varieties that are native is always great. I think I saw that in a few of the presentations that y'all have some trees. So I don't know if you knew, probably you do, but the at Overton, the park, the old forest in there has, I think it's the biggest native pawpaw grove in the whole US, which is pretty cool. There's also persimmons that are native to the area. The Tennessee Department of Agriculture has a lot of information about the specific cultivars that are beneficial for this area. I will say that pears and peaches do very well, as well as figs. The figs will either look dead in the winter and you'll think that it's dead and then they'll come back, or there's certain people that will like build the cages around the figs and then put mulch in it so it keeps them warm so they don't know that it's winter, so that they don't die back. The effectiveness of that, I'm not sure. And yeah, another thing to consider is the just the high humidity in this area in terms of selecting for which rootstock and scions to decide on when planting a fruit tree. This is a general timeline of when you can harvest. So that's another thing of, you know, if, for example, planting in schools, if we're only planting apples and pears that only, you know, come to fruit in the summer and no one's there to actually harvest them, that's something to consider. So if this is for your home or community garden and people are going to be there throughout the year, it's not as big of a deal, but it's something to consider when the fruit actually comes and if someone will be there to harvest it. So here's a calendar for that. And here are some pictures of the nursery. And I have no way of seeing if there are questions. Oh,
I'll handle it for you. So we did have a couple procedural questions. If someone's interested in working with the Giving Grove, I mean, so we just go out to Memphis Tilth and contact you that way, and you can tell, and they can find out about like how to volunteer in their area or what the opportunities are if they want to do those kinds of things.
Yes, absolutely. I was going to circle back to that, so I appreciate that question. We definitely could use help. There's many we're in the planting season right now, so we're doing a lot of plantings in this month. So if you want to do physical work, we would love that. If you would like to donate some money to help the program, there's also ways to do that as well. I included my email, but it's literally dana@memphistilth.org. It's in the first slide, but if you want to email me, I can get you all, you know, set up with ways to get involved.
Okay. Another question about the program was, since you mentioned so much maintenance that has to go on, do you guys then handle all that as far as, you know, taking care of the trees, pruning them, spraying them, or whatever has to happen? That's part of the process in the long haul?
That's a great question. So a part of what the Giving Grove program is that we're kind of like a coaching program. So for each site, before we even agree to plant, we need to make sure that there are 2 people that are very committed, that are the site stewards, and that if they leave the community or a school or wherever for whatever reason, that they are then in charge of finding somebody else to replace themselves. So it's a requirement to have 2 stewards that are the ones actually doing the work, but we come out and we provide all the educational material for the first few years. We give pruning advice. We'll come and teach you instead of us just coming, scheduling a day to do it ourselves. It's about cultivating an understanding of how to do it on your own. So each site has to have at least 2 people that are in charge of that, but we're kind of the teachers of it.
Okay.
Yeah.
All righty. So you had mentioned several things that you wanted to share. You had your calendar of when to do things and that kind of stuff. I'll say this, if you want to pull those out and email them to me, I'll make sure they get out to the membership.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And the other thing I was going to mention was when you mentioned soil testing, I think a lot of our listeners tonight know, but the extension office at the Agri Center, they do soil testing, and they also have, our 2 land grant universities and the Extension Service do have publications about the some of these cultivars that do well in this area. The problem being is you have to be careful. I think you all know this, with looking at the things that do well in Memphis, not Knoxville, because we have significantly different weather. And so, but we do have state-based materials. So don't forget that the Master Gardener's Office is always a good resource, because they can either answer your questions or they can get you to those programs. So, okay. I'm gonna keep that's brief questions here, because we have had a super jumbo size program this evening, but it's been a lot of interesting stuff and a lot of good speakers. I appreciate all of our speakers this evening. I appreciate Dana sort of condensing this, and I appreciate everybody showing up. We do this again on Tuesday, May 4th. So please, it'll be another Zoom-based session. So please put that on your calendar, and we'll have information out about that program for you soon. So again, thanks to all the speakers, especially for Dana, for hanging in there so long through all the other presentations to get to the one about the Giving Grove. And thank you very much. So appreciate everybody. Have a great evening, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much.